joining us for the second professional development webinar of the Winter 2020 series. My name is Awish Aslam, and I am the chair and central rep for the CSA Student Concerns Subcommittee. The committee also includes your Eastern rep, Emma Kay, and your Western rep, Nicole Millette.
Hi everyone.
We'd like to thank the Canadian Sociological Association for sponsoring this initiative, and Sherry Fox, the Executive Director of the CSA, for working with us to plan and organize this series. Today's webinar is titled From Draft to Article, the process of publishing in an academic journal, and our guest speaker is Dr. Patrick Denice. Patrick is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Western Ontario. He received his PhD from the University of Washington in 2016, and his work explores inequality in education and the labor market. Patrick has published in the American Sociological Review, Demography, and Sociology of Education, among others. He has also been a reviewer for a number of journals, including the American Journal of Sociology, the British Journal of Sociology, and Social Science Research. Patrick also has experience on the editorial board of Sociology of Education. Thank you very much for joining us today, Patrick. Before we begin, I'd like to invite audience members to submit any questions you might have for Patrick during his presentation or during the formal Q&A section of the webinar. You can pose questions by using the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Your questions will be visible to all attendees and panelists, and you may also like questions to prioritize them for Patrick. Now I will turn the webinar over to Patrick.
Great, thanks, Awish. So I'm very happy to be talking to you all about publishing in academic journals. Before I get started, we've got just a couple of questions just to see where people are at in terms of their experience with publishing. So if you wouldn't mind taking a quick second to answer these two questions. First, have you ever submitted an abstract to an academic journal? And then if so, has one of your submitted papers been extended an invitation to revise and resubmit, what we commonly call an R&R? I'll give you a few seconds to answer that question. All right, so it looks like most folks here, probably not unexpected, have relatively little experience in publishing an academic journal, which I think is why a webinar like this is so important. So thank you for doing. We'll get started. I cover things in our shorter. First, you decide but after you submit your major journal, what does the process look like? From the journal and reviewers. How do you
This is Sherry Fox speaking. Patrick, we have an issue with the microphone. Could you take a moment and resolve?
you respond? You next.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're having a bit of a technical issue with the sound on Patrick's end. So it'll just be a few minutes. We're going to try and resolve that.
hear me now? Okay, for some reason, my computer flipped out, but we press on. Okay, so as before I get started in talking about sort of the nuts and bolts of the publication process, I just want to briefly cover why we might want to publish in academic journals. There are lots of reasons, and I think the two of the most important include, first, publishing advances good science. When we publish, we engage in the existing body of knowledge around our topic of interest. We provide our own unique contributions to that knowledge, and the publishing process, as we'll see, helps to validate and control the quality of that research. And secondly, publishing looks good on our CVs. Many search committees, whether you're looking for a faculty job or whether you want to work as an analyst at a research or policy center in the government or in some other organization, you'll want to demonstrate evidence of your potential as a researcher. Publishing serves as proof of that potential. You will have demonstrated your ability to ask questions that the research community finds interesting and important, and you will have answered those questions with appropriate data and methods. Okay, next slide, please. Especially if you're just starting out in academia, you might not be aware of all of the potential outlets for your work, and there are a lot of options out there. To help you think about the journals you might submit to, I have 3 recommendations. First, look to professional association websites. For instance, the American Sociological Association manages 14 sociology journals. Their website also includes yearly editor reports, which can give you a sense of what the editors of those journals are looking for, how many submissions they get a year, and how they go about making their editorial decisions. Second, check out the CVs of colleagues, faculty, and authors you either cite or who you know work in your area of interest. If I'm working, say, on a paper about the gender wage gap, and I know of a few scholars who also work on that topic, in part because I'm citing and engaging with their work, I might look at their CVs to see which journals have been receptive to their papers. And maybe they're good fits for my work too. And third, there are also listings of journals online. I've included the links here of 2 of my go-to sites, which helpfully organize journals by subject area, like demography and education. And they allow for easy searching, so you can search for particular journals. These sites also include metrics about the journal's reach, which brings me to my next point, still on this slide. When you've identified a journal or set of journals that you think might be good outlets for your work, there are some things to look out for. First, as I've already alluded to, you'll want to have a sense of how good the journals are. Journals certainly vary in their quality. A common metric used to judge a journal's quality is the impact factor. It's not a perfect measure, and there are others out there, but the impact factor is one measure, and it's a measure of how often the average article in a journal has been cited in a given year. In sociology, impact factors around 1 are pretty good, but there's a lot of variation. So our flagship journal, the American Sociological Review, has an impact factor of over 5. Second, pay attention to the scope and aims of the journal. Most journals clearly lay these out somewhere on their website. This information tells you what kind of research the journal is interested in publishing, what topics or research questions are appropriate to the journal, whether the journal specializes in a particular discipline or region of the world or methodological approach. Is the journal open to different kinds of articles? So in addition to the usual empirical studies, does the journal also accept book reviews, theoretical pieces, or overviews of the literature? And third, I scroll through the recently published articles by the journal, both those contained in the past few issues and those that have been accepted but not yet assigned to an issue. On journal websites, these are often under a heading like Online First. Looking at these recently published articles will help give you a sense of the topics, the style, and the methodology preferred by that journal. These are, after all, articles that the current editor and editorial board have selected, so they're probably a good signal of what they're interested in. I'll also say here, though, that the flip side may also be true. If you've got a paper that is very similar to a recent article in a journal, you may want to look elsewhere. Journals have a limited number of pages, so if they've just published something on your exact question, they may take a pass on the next one they receive. And finally, be aware of predatory journals. There are many legitimate places to send your work. There are also many, many outlets out there that just want to make a buck. How can you tell if a journal is predatory? Well, there's two websites that I've listed here that give a list of some of those journals. Generally, though, if you get an email from a journal and the email feels fishy, the email sort of all but assures you that they're going to publish your work. They ask if you'll publish a paper that's already been published elsewhere, or they ask for a hefty fee up front. It's probably a scam. Next slide. Okay, after I get a sense of what journals are out there, I like to narrow them down by asking myself a series of questions. I start with the big picture. What discipline am I writing in? I do work that sometimes crosses disciplinary boundaries. So is the particular paper I'm writing now more sociology, more education, more urban affairs? What's the broad discipline I'm writing in? Next, think about whether the paper is better suited for a broad or generalist journal or one in a specific field or subfield. If I've decided that the discipline is sociology, then do I try to get my work published in a generalist sociology journal like Social Science Research, the American Sociological Review? Or do I think it's better suited for a subfield of sociology, like sociology of education? The aims and scope sections on journals' websites can help you narrow your choices here. And finally, I look at my own reference list. What journals am I citing for this particular paper? If I'm constantly citing articles from a particular journal or journals, then it's reasonable to think that my paper will be a good fit there. Kind of as an added bonus, journals really appreciate when you cite their own articles. And I'll share with you one of the most helpful pieces of advice that I've received. And that's to always have a list of 3 journals for a particular paper and rank those journals. For instance, I'm working on a paper now, and my ranked list, for now, subject to change, is Social Problems, Sociology of Education, and City and Community. I'm going to start by submitting my paper to the first journal on my list. If it gets accepted, great. If not, well, I've already thought about and done the research into other journals that might be appropriate places for my paper. So if it gets rejected by my top choice, I'll just turn the paper around pretty quickly and submit my paper to the next journal on my list, and I'll come up with a new 3rd journal. Okay, perfect. You've identified some journals that you think would be good fits for your work. What comes next? Well, it's time to finish writing and then submit your paper. Just as recently published articles can help you decide on what journal to submit to, once you've chosen a journal, they can also help you properly format your paper. Look, for instance, at those recent published articles, at whether and how those articles use headings and subheadings, whether they explicitly list hypotheses and expectations, how many tables and figures do they generally have, how long are each of the sections, right? Journals are going to vary in how long they want the introduction, the lit review, etc. So take a look at the general style and format of recently published articles in that journal. You'll also want to pay attention to any formatting requirements that the journal has. Most journals have explicit instructions for authors about things like formatting references, using endnotes or footnotes. whether to embed tables and figures into the main body of the manuscript or compile them all at the end in a separate section. Next, know that when you go to submit a manuscript, many journals will ask you for a few other things. For instance, they might ask you for a cover letter addressed to the editor that briefly lays out the aims and contribution of your paper and why you think it's a good fit for their journal in particular. You might also have to prepare a title page with the title, the abstract, your contact information, and some keywords that describe the paper. And most journals will also ask for a blinded copy of the manuscript, a blinded copy of the paper itself. Since most journals conduct double-blind reviews, that is, you won't know who your reviewers are, and your reviewers won't know who you are, the copy of the paper that gets sent to reviewers should have no identifying information, not your name anywhere. And finally, just be aware that most journals do charge a small submission fee, usually on the order of 20 to 50 bucks. And often there are many journals out there that'll waive this fee for graduate students. Next. Okay, what happens next? You've submitted your paper to a journal. What do you do now? Well, you wait. How long? That really depends. Sometimes that information can be found on the journal's website, or in the case of the 14 ASA journals, on the ASA's website. But you're waiting for as little as a couple days to several months. If you don't hear anything after about 12 weeks of submitting your paper, it is okay to very politely send an email to the editor of the journal asking about the status of your manuscript. What are you waiting for? Well, you're waiting for the editor to make a decision about your paper. Journals vary widely in the precise details of the process, but I thought in this next part that I'd walk you through a typical process. Next slide, yep. So I'm going to use an example from the journal Sociology of Education, and specifically, we're going to look at what happened to the 264 new papers that journal received in 2018. Of those new manuscripts, the editor makes a decision. They'll either decide to send those papers out for external review, or what we call desk reject them. Basically, send them back to you, the author, without sending them to reviewers. This initial decision of whether to send them out for review or whether to desk reject the paper is usually pretty fast. It usually takes about 1 to a few weeks. And we can see here that in 2018, at Sociology of Education, the editor sent out about 80% of all new papers it received and desk rejected 20%. Now, I'll just note here that there's lots of variation among journals. Many journals, for instance, will reverse those two percentages. They'll opt to send out for review only about 20% and desk reject 80%. So this varies widely, but again, we're going to walk through this particular example. At this stage, what's the editor looking for? Well, they're looking for formatting. Is your paper formatted in the way that they prefer? Does the paper generally fit the journal's scope and aims? And is there a sort of baseline level of quality? Is it reasonably well written? Is there an interesting research question? Are the data and methods appropriate to that question? Often though, the editor at this stage is just skimming your paper. They're probably not reading it in depth. For those papers that do get sent out for review, you'll likely have to wait a couple months to hear anything back. You probably won't even hear that the paper has been sent out. You just won't have heard that it has been desk rejected. If a paper gets sent out for external review, then the question is, what are those external reviewers looking for? So at this point, usually between 2 and 4 reviewers, that is other researchers in the field, read your paper much more closely, and they provide comments and a recommendation to the editor. They're looking for things like, is there a compelling research question? Is the contribution clearly articulated? Is there a theoretical and conceptual framework? Does the paper demonstrate a strong grasp of the literature and where this study fits? Are the data and methods appropriate to the research question? Is the paper accurate? Does it accurately describe the data, the findings? Are the figures in the, are the estimates in the tables and figures accurate? Are findings interpreted in a way that's grounded in the data? Are tables and figures helpful and clear? And do the conclusions synthesize the findings and discuss implications without speaking too far beyond the data? Each reviewer will submit between 1 and several pages of comments for the author. This is feedback that will be returned to you, so you'll actually get to see what they think. Each reviewer will also submit a set of confidential comments and a confidential overall summary recommendation for the editor. So they'll tell the editor whether they think the manuscript should be accepted or rejected. The editor then, taking all of this information from the reviewers into account, makes one of 3 decisions. They can conditionally accept the paper. The paper is more or less perfect as it is, and the reviewers found no need for further revision. The editor might have some small suggestions for you, but otherwise it's good to go. At this stage, at most journals, this outcome is vanishingly rare. The editor might also decide to offer you as the author an opportunity to revise and resubmit your paper. The reviewers like your paper, and they see some promise in its contribution, but they recommend a number of changes. Sometimes those are pretty minor. Other times, they'll ask for substantial conceptual or methodological improvements. And finally, the editor may decide to reject your paper. The reviewers weren't sold on the paper as written, and they don't believe that simply revising this paper will improve its chances of being accepted at this particular journal. So if we click one more time, yep, we'll see that at Sociology of Education, no papers were conditionally accepted at this stage. About 1 in 5 were offered an opportunity to revise and resubmit, and 80%, most, are rejected at this stage. When you do get an R&R, a revise and resubmit, you'll have a period of time, generally a few months, to make those revisions and resubmit your paper for additional review. When you resubmit your paper, the paper will get sent back out to reviewers, often the same ones who reviewed the original submission, but sometimes a new 1 or 2 reviewers. And again, the reviewers will read the paper closely and consider how well you responded to their initial suggestions and concerns. And again, they'll provide feedback to you and an overall recommendation to the editor. And the editor then makes one last decision. They'll either conditionally accept the paper, offer another opportunity to revise and resubmit, or reject the paper. And if we click one more time, at Sociology of Education, most papers at this point are conditionally accepted. About 20% are returned to the reviewer or to the author for more revisions, and another 10% are rejected. Next, please. Great. When a decision has been made on your paper at any stage, you'll probably get a heart-wrenching and sort of ominous sounding email with a subject line, something to the effect of, "A decision has been made on your manuscript." Take a deep breath and open the email. If your paper is rejected, I'm not gonna lie, it's not gonna feel great, and it doesn't really get easier. But don't take it personally. Your paper will find a home. Sometimes it just takes a little trial and error. Look back to your ranked list of target journals and take what you can from the editors and reviewers' feedback. Maybe they have some good suggestions for how to improve the paper before you submit it to the next place. In fact, you might get the same reviewer at the next journal, so it's generally a good idea to at least consider their comments seriously. If your paper, on the other hand, is extended an opportunity to revise and resubmit. Count this as a win and update your CV. Here's what I generally do when I get an R&R. I read through the reviews just to get an initial sense of what the reviewers did and didn't like about the paper. And then I put the paper and comments away for at least a day, more often a few weeks. I know that I need some distance and time to reflect on the paper and think about what I need to do to make it stronger and increase its chances of publication in the next round. After some period of time, I go back to the reviews and I make a plan. I put all of the reviewers' suggestions, comments, questions, concerns in a new document so that they're all organized in one place. I think about which I'm going to tackle first and which I'm going to save for later. And I give myself a deadline. The journal will often give you a deadline, but I set my own as well. And I think concretely about how I'm going to budget my time over the next few weeks and months to turn the paper around. And then I work through the revisions. As you're working through the revisions and responding to the comments and questions from the reviewers, be sure to take notes. When you go to resubmit your paper, in addition to the revised manuscript itself, the journal will often ask you to prepare a memo to the reviewers that outlines how you responded to each of their questions, suggestions, and comments. So it's helpful to take notes as you do this along the way. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up here, and then I'm happy to answer your questions. I just want to offer a few pieces of other advice. So first, be patient. Academic publishing takes a long time, years in fact. And you'll often have to wait a while before getting feedback in the form of reviews and a decision from the editor. Second, and I've already said this, don't take rejection personally. It's gonna happen, and it happens to the best researchers. But just know that most reviewers and editors are operating in good faith. They're committed to the scientific enterprise, and many see reviewing as an important part of their service to the discipline. Next, celebrate the wins, and getting an R&R is a huge win. And finally, talk to your advisor throughout the whole process of publication, from an initial idea of a paper you have to how to respond to editors' decisions and reviewers' comments. And in fact, I'd recommend that you ask your advisor to see a full publication packet. For one of their papers, ask to see the initial submission, so the paper they initially submitted, the reviews they got, their revision of that paper, their revision memo that they wrote to the reviewers, and the final published article. I think this will take some mystery out of the process, and it will show that more likely than not, the initial submission looks very different from the final published article, which I think is a good thing, generally speaking, since it represents progress and the incorporation of some usually helpful feedback along the way. Okay, I will end there, but I'm excited to hear what questions you have.
Great.
And sorry again about the computer issue.
Oh, no problem. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation, Patrick. We will now turn the questions over to the audience. So I'll be reading out the questions that the audience has submitted through the Q&A function, as well as some of the questions we received in advance of the webinar. So the first one that I'm going to go to is, can publishing ever look bad on your resume if it's not a good journal?
Oh, that's a good question. Yes, you do want to be, so almost every question I answer will start with "it depends." So just assume that I say "it depends." But like I said before, journals do vary widely in quality. It won't necessarily look bad if the journal you submit to has, say, a slightly lower impact factor or maybe slightly lower ranked, provided that it's a journal that your work speaks to, so it's in your discipline or subfield, and that it's not a predatory journal. So journals that are truly predatory, and again, I've given a couple links that give a list of many of those journals. provided it's not a predatory journal. Most publications are going to be good news for you in your CV. Of course, you want to try and get your paper into, the highest quality journal with the furthest reach, that's the most well-regarded in your discipline. But there's variation even there. So for instance, when I think through what might be good generalist or broad journals, my first instinct is to think, oh, I'm going to try and get this in the American Journal of Sociology, one of the flagships. But I know that's probably not going to be realistic for me. And so I will probably start looking a little bit lower down in the list, knowing that it's still going to send a signal that my paper was deemed interesting and important by a set of external reviewers.
Great, thanks. I'm actually going to piggyback on to that question with another question that we received. If you're looking for a career in academia, would it be better to hold off on publishing if you're not confident it can be accepted in a good journal, or is it better to have a large volume of publications on your CV?
Yeah, this question of quality versus quantity is a good one. Generally, I think I'd lean towards quality. Certainly the aim when you complete graduate school, that is when you complete your PhD and go out on the job market, is to have a couple papers that have been published. Doesn't mean you have to have 10 or 15 or enough to get tenure, right, at a place. But you should aim for at least one or two or so.
Okay.
Great. Sorry, just a little bit more.
Yep.
That sort of means that that you sort of want to balance quality versus quantity. So definitely aim for quality. Try and get your paper as strong as you can get it. Send it to the best journal that you think is a good fit for that paper. But recognize that there's a ton of journals out there. So every paper has a home somewhere.
Thank you. Another question. Are book reviews less prestigious to publish? And is there a type of publication that is more valued in academia?
That's a good question. So there is generally a hierarchy of publications. An empirical, whether that's quantitative or qualitative, just an empirical study, sort of what we think of when we usually think of a journal article, is sort of the gold standard. That's what we should be aiming for. Papers that you submit to edited volumes, and that will come out as chapters in books, those are useful on the CV, but certainly if we were to rank them, they'd be ranked under empirical journal article. And book reviews are certainly evidence that you're engaging with the literature, you're engaging with the body of scholarship that's out there in your field, but they too would be ranked as sort of a little bit under the usual empirical journal article. That's not to say don't do them, but if you're faced with a choice between getting a book review out, sort of drafted and published, and making progress on turning, say, your MA thesis into a journal article, go with the MA thesis to journal article.
Okay, great. Along the same lines of what kinds of things should we be publishing or aiming for, another question is, are you familiar with submitting non-empirical papers to journals, and could you maybe speak about them? Is it possible to submit theoretical essays from graduate level coursework that doesn't use data?
Yeah, there are definitely journals out there which accept a variety of kinds of work. So when I recommended sort of to look at the aims and scope of journals you might be interested in, that section on the journal's website should give you an idea of what kinds of articles or papers they accept beyond the traditional empirical journal article. So there are definitely journals out there that accept theoretical pieces. There are whole journals dedicated to what are essentially literature reviews. And yeah, so I would suggest if you've got an idea for something that you'd like to develop into a publishable paper, chances are there is a journal out there that'll publish that kind of work, even if it doesn't fit, our definition of a traditional empirical article.
Great. So along the lines of questions regarding submission and the types of work that you want to put forward, what are
Mhm.
the kinds of things that you think that we should include in our cover letters?
That's a good question. So the cover letters should be really brief. If they go over a page, you've probably written too much. When I approach a cover letter, I usually have 3 very quick paragraphs. The first paragraph does the usual, I'm really excited. I don't say I'm really excited. I enthusiastically submit my article titled X to journal Y. The next paragraph, very quickly, certainly not as long as the abstract of the paper, but very quickly tells the editor what this paper does. What research question does it answer? Sometimes what data does it use to answer that question? And maybe what is the high level finding? So very quick, couple of sentence paragraph. And then the final paragraph for me tries to convince the editor that their journal is the right home for my paper. So if say I'm submitting to the Sociology of Education, I will want to look at the aims and scope of that journal in particular and think about what elements of my paper make it the right fit for those aims and scope. So real quick, 3 paragraphs. It's very short, but it just gives the editor a quick idea of what my paper is all about, because again, they're probably not reading your paper in depth.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. Another question. What happens if once your paper is accepted for an R&R and you get that feedback back, if there are 2 reviewers providing conflicting comments?
Yes, that is a great question, and it happens not infrequently. That is to say, it happens a lot. There are a couple different strategies. So first, there are some editors out there which will try to help you adjudicate between the 2 reviewers' conflicting suggestions. So some editors will actually take a pretty active role in their decision letter to you to try and guide you toward one reviewer's comments or the other, because they have an idea of what they would like your paper to look like. If they do that, then rely on what the editor is saying, right? Because they're the ones who are ultimately going to make the decision on your paper. If the editor doesn't do that, and they sort of leave you as the author to fend for yourself against these conflicting reviewers, well, then use the reviewer memo, right? The memo you write to reviewers outlining all of the changes you made to sort of dive into that contradiction, right? So what I'll do sometimes in those cases is I'll engage with both reviewers. And sometimes I'll try and answer both of them. Here's an example. Let's say one reviewer is asking for more analyses or like a different kind of model. And another reviewer says, you need to scale back. Your paper tries to do too much, you need to do less. Well, to the reviewer who's asking for more, maybe I'll actually run the analysis that they recommend, not put it in the paper, but put it in the revision memo. So that the reviewer can see that I took their comments seriously, but then I'll explain why it's not the right decision for my paper as I see it. Perhaps what they're asking for is beyond the scope of the study. Perhaps what they're asking for is in direct contradiction to what the editor or another reviewer said. But I will at least have shown them that I'm taking their suggestions seriously. And if they're really interested in that additional analysis, say, then it's in the revision memo. So I try to use the revision memo, and for me, they can be quite long, to engage with each piece of the reviewer, all of the reviewer's comments, while making it very clear what ends up in the revised manuscript and what doesn't.
Okay, great. Along the same vein, I'm just trying to keep things in a conversational flow here. When you're doing an R&R and maybe you've become really overwhelmed, or maybe this piece has been rejected by several journals, when do you abandon the process?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you get an R&R, you should probably not abandon the process, right? Your paper at the R&R stage, if you're writing if you've been invited to write a revision of your paper, that's a really good sign, right? The editor has committed in some way, they've invested in your paper. They want to see your paper succeed. Otherwise, they would have rejected it, either without sending it out for review or after getting some reviews and taking in the reviewer's feedback. So if you've got an R&R, stick with it. Try and respond to the reviewer's comments and get the paper back to the journal. The editor wants to see a revision. Now, if you're feeling overwhelmed and you come up against the editor's deadline for the R&R, just email the journal and ask for an extension. Chances are, when you email the journal, you're not actually emailing the editor themselves. You're probably emailing another graduate student who's managing the journal. And the deadlines are pretty arbitrary anyway. So if you're feeling overwhelmed and you think another week or couple weeks might help you respond better to the reviewers, ask for more time. Now, if you're not at an R&R stage, if your paper has been rejected by 3, 4, 5 journals, first, recognize that that's not uncommon. You're in good company. And second, think about what might not be working about your paper, right? At that point now, you've a number of journals, a number of reviewers, a number of editors have seen your paper, and they're all responding to it in a similar way. Is there some way you can think about how to refine your research question, better articulate the existing literature and how your paper offers a contribution to it? Maybe you need to add some more data. Maybe the case you're making, the argument you're making, isn't being effectively supported by the data you have. So maybe you need to collect more data. These are things I think that if you get rejected from multiple journals, to try and think about, because you've gone through the sort of trouble and labor of writing a paper. It may not have found a home yet. Certainly there's a home for it out there somewhere, but you may have to do some revising before sending it out to a new journal.
Okay, great. Along similar lines of getting published or picked up by an editor, what kinds of considerations do journal editors have in relation to submissions from non-native speakers or writers?
It's a really good question. So to be honest, when the editor first sees the paper and is making a recommendation, they're probably not reading it closely enough to know one way or the other. So they're really deciding whether to send it out for review or to desk reject the paper based on, does it ask an interesting question? Does it use data and methods that are appropriate to the question? And does the topic under consideration by the paper fit with the aims and scope of the journal? The reviewers are the ones who are going to read the paper much more closely. And I can tell you from at least my experience as a reviewer, but also my experience on an editorial board, reading reviewers' comments about a lot of different papers that vary widely in style, in grammar, in sort of writing clarity, whether or not someone's a native English speaker or not, right? I can say that the reviewers are generally going to give the benefit of the doubt to the author. That is, even if the paper could use some editing, and editing comes, sort of copy editing comes later in the process anyway. If the paper could use some editing, most reviewers will try and look past that and see what the paper is actually about. So they'll take the paper on its substantive merits more often, I think, than they will on the style of the paper. Again, once the paper is fully accepted to a journal, it then goes through another more intensive copy editing process where issues like that can sort of be cleaned up.
Okay, great. And then this question coincides with that question as well. And if you don't feel comfortable answering it, that's completely fine. You mentioned previously that you had experience as a reviewer. Can you tell us, for you, what differentiates papers that you think should be put forward or get a solid R&R and ones that don't?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, and this varies a little bit by the journal, right? So if I'm reviewing for a broad generalist journal like Social Science Research or the American Sociological Review, I'm looking for papers that develop and strongly support an argument that speaks to the discipline of sociology in full, right? Versus if I'm looking at a paper and reviewing a paper for sociology of education, then sort of the focus and the literature that it needs to speak to is a little bit narrower. Sort of regardless, what I'm looking for is really some of the things that I mentioned before. So does the paper make a clear case for its contribution? That is, does it use the literature review to identify an important gap in the literature and specify pretty clearly how their paper starts to fill that gap? I'm looking for not only an interesting research question, but one that's answerable by their data and methods. So I especially look for a match between data and methods and the question being asked. I also look for whether the front end of the paper, so the introduction, background, and literature review, whether those help prepare the reader for what comes next in the findings. That is, the literature review should have a goal. And that goal should be first, again, to convince the reader that there's this important gap in the literature. But second, to try and build toward a set of hypotheses or expectations that'll be tested by the data, tested by the methodology and findings. So I'm what I'm looking for overall is that the paper flows really nicely, that the introduction, the background and literature review, the data and methods and findings all build toward the same ends. Does that help?
Yeah, that's great. I'm just going to remind everyone that we have only a few more minutes to answer questions. And if we don't get through them all, we will answer them online for the transcript recording. But for the next question, will academic journals accept submissions from people not in academia? For example, will they accept papers for someone who wrote during grad school, even if they've graduated?
Absolutely. Yes. You do not need an academic affiliation to submit a paper to a journal.
Great. And can somebody tweak the same paper and publish it more than once in different papers, although the bulk of it is similar? Or can they break it up in parts for one paper and then send it out to different papers as different papers?
Yeah. The papers that you submit for publication need to be sufficiently different. If they're answering the same research question, that's one thing. I mean, a lot of papers out there answer the same like general research question, right? But if they're answering the exact same specific research question, the papers are probably too similar. If they're using the same data and methods, that's probably okay, provided you're using those data to answer sufficiently different research questions. Certainly when we write our first drafts of papers, they may be too big, right? And may cover too much ground for a single journal publication. And then it's important to think about how do you break it up so that the two resulting papers are sufficiently different. They should not ask the same exact question, and they should not sort of pose the same or provide the same exact pieces of evidence. So I keep using the word sufficiently different, and that's a little bit vague, but they should be sufficiently different.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to smush the last two questions into one question for the sake of time, but I think that it'll be doable. So
Sure.
Can you speak about open access publications and edited volumes?
Yeah, kind of what they are, or?
I think so. And are they worthwhile in terms of publications for grad students?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, I think they are worthwhile. Now there's a couple ways to think about open access, right? Open access can refer to the process which is becoming more popular in sociology, where we publish a working, or we post a working paper on some hosted website like Social Archive is one that's becoming really big. That's not the same as publishing a paper. That's posting a working paper that you hope to get some feedback on to make it more ready to publish. So that's one way of thinking about open access. The other way of thinking about open access is whether, when your paper has been submitted to a journal, you decide whether at that journal to host your paper open access, in which case you'll often have to pay the open access fee to the journal, or to leave the paper behind the journal's paywall. That's a kind of question that's probably best dealt with on a case-by-case scenario, and so you might ask your advisor specifically about that. I don't have any strong feelings one way or the other, but that'll usually refer to your paper's already been submitted, and so you're deciding whether or not at that particular journal you're going to let it be open access or not. And then finally, about edited volumes, certainly they do count toward peer-reviewed publications, and so they're good lines on your CV. You know, I would maybe think about whether your paper is a really good fit for that edited volume, in which case absolutely pursue it, or whether it's a little bit broader and so might otherwise find a home in a peer-reviewed journal. I think the sort of hierarchy distinction isn't so strong between journal articles and edited volumes, but it does exist, with journal articles being a little bit above.
Okay, great. Do you have any other notes or comments that you'd like to pass along to our attendees?
I don't think so, beyond, you know, keep at it. I think for me, one of the most rewarding parts about the publication process, even though it can take a long time, is that other researchers out there are engaging in your work. And again, they're often doing it on good faith, trying to make the work better. So that can be a rewarding part of the process, even if it takes a long time and can be frustrating.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I think we'll just go ahead and we'll wrap everything up. So thank you all very much for attending. And thank you, Patrick, for your presentation. It was really helpful and really informative, and for addressing our questions. A recording of the webinar will be posted online at the CSA, students at CSA webpage, along with responses to any questions that we did not have time to address here. Audience members will also be receiving a feedback survey from us, so we'd appreciate it if you could please fill that out. See y'all next time, and thank you so much for taking part. Bye-bye.